So I'd like to thank the session or the conference organizers for putting on a spectacular conference and the discussants for leading the discussion here. This is joint work with John Pogash, also of the FDIC. The usual disclaimer about these being our own views and not those of the FDIC applies. This is the beginning, not the end of this research. So that's the perfect time to present it so that we can incorporate the feedback we receive. But it also means things may change. We're already digesting Rodney and Edison's work on credit unions and figuring out how to bring them into our analysis. So let's begin with a summary. What do we know? What do you know? Big banks are expanding in particular parts of the country. Small banks are doing relatively worse in these areas. There are a few common hypotheses for why this is, including regulatory burden, technology, and the proliferation of large banking organizations, for example. We'll return to this. We, in this paper, exploit merger activity as variation in big bank competition, and we use that to measure the effects of big banks on small banks. What we find is that small banks are impacted positively from big bank merger activity. Acquired branches see less deposit growth. This is what bank examiners expected us to find. Some customers simply do not want a relationship with a big bank. We see that small branches do not attrit more or grow less. There is evidence of greater small bank entrance into affected areas, and we conclude these based on within-county analyses. We don't see any signs of the effects of proximity to an acquired large branch or to an acquired branch by a large bank. We don't see any of the effects on deposit growth. And we see this both within county and within zip code. I'll talk more about these levels of analysis when I describe our identification strategy. So I want to start with the view from 35,000 feet. Here is a chart of banks over time. By small, we mean banks or branches of banking organizations with real assets less than $1 billion in 2010 dollars. Big means real assets greater than 50 billion, and intermediate or medium-sized banks is everything in between. The horizontal lines in these graphs track the total numbers, either small banks or total banks in this case, compared to 1987. There are two vertical lines. The leftmost one announces Regal Neal, which eliminated restrictions on interstate branching. I'll present most statistics as a comparison to the passage of Regal Neal in 1994. The other vertical line relates to Dodd-Frank. So what do we see? We see the number of banks, and particularly small banks, has fallen precipitously. Compared to 1994, the number of small banks has been cut in half, accounting for 80% of the total decrease in banking institutions over this time. We also see that this has been going on for a while. While bank numbers have fallen a lot, branches have actually increased. In 1994, branches of small banks were 37% of the national total. By 2016, small bank branches were down to 26% of the national total, despite total bank branches increasing by 13% since '94. So we see that branches of big banks are growing and branches of small banks are declining. Again, this has been going on for a while. The story with deposits is the same. Big banks increased their share of industry deposits from 33% to 68% from '94 to 2016. Essentially, all of the growth in deposits since '94, and then some, has accrued to big banks. So that's the story nationally. The number of banks has fallen dramatically. Branch numbers are up somewhat overall, and industry deposits are up a lot. But the growth in both has come almost exclusively from big banks. But those national trends hide a deeper story. While I'm sure we need no more evidence of this, but the country is not experiencing economic trends uniformly. Here we see nominal gross county product, that is economic activity, and population trends, but split by metropolitan statistical areas and non-MSAs. MSA growth in economic activity was 50% stronger than in non-MSAs. The population growth rate is more than 3 times higher in MSAs than non-MSAs since 1994. We see these effects within the banking industry. Now, before you do anything looking at them, a quick word of caution: the scales are different, very, very different. So don't just look horizontally. Total branches, which I just said had increased by 13% across the country since 1994, increased by 16% in MSAs, but only 3% in non-MSAs. Real deposits doubled within MSAs since 1994, but increased by only 15% in non-MSAs. So we see banking activity is growing much more strongly in MSAs than non-MSAs. But it is in exactly these areas where small banks are doing relatively worse. And I say relatively, I want to emphasize that. The left graphic shows branch growth since 1994, both overall and in terms of small branches, separated by MSAs and non-MSAs. So this top line right here, that is all overall branch growth in MSAs. The solid line is overall branch growth in non-MSAs. Now these two dashed lines, this one is small branch growth in non-MSAs. Remember, overall branch growth was right here, small branch growth is right here. And this is small branch growth in MSAs, recalling that overall branch growth is up here. The right graphic plots this difference between overall branch growth and small branch growth, which we call the growth economy small bank gap. Here are the same graphs, the same takeaways for real deposits. So what do we know? Banks are growing more in MSAs than in non-MSAs, yet small banks are doing relatively worse in MSAs than non-MSAs. And I haven't exactly showed you this, but big banks are expanding more into and within MSAs than non-MSAs. So this leads to a natural question. Is big bank expansion harming small banks? For example, do small banks that are more affected by the entrance of big banks or the expansion of big banks, do they see lower deposit growth? Do they see greater attrition or reduced opportunities? I want to pause for a tangent here. A common explanation for the fate, and I'll just say fate unadorned with adjectives, of small banks is regulatory burden. First, Dodd-Frank is usually put forth as a culprit, but we can see these trends extend well before 2010. Second, to the extent that the intuition behind regulation as the headwind facing small banks, and I admit the intuition is attractive, we need to be able to understand the impact of regulation varying between MSAs and non-MSAs. Here I'm skeptical, but I'd like to be proven wrong. So we consider mergers in which a large bank acquires a medium-sized bank. At least 10 branches are acquired. I'll talk about why that's important later. The banking organization of the acquired CERT was intermediate-sized, and the new combined banking organization is big. And then we're going to look at counties and zip codes where big banks entered. Our universe of mergers does not include big banks taking over other big banks, nor does it include big banks taking over small banks. We look at instances where the number of competing branches is unchanged, while only the depth of their available resources changes. Put another way, we don't conflate competition from new branches entering with competition from the identity of existing branches changing. Second, we look only at mergers where a sufficient number of branches are acquired. We believe that while the acquirer may have sought to enter a county, given the number of branches acquired, the acquirer was not choosing the specific street locations or even zip codes to enter. Bear in mind, if the acquirer was targeting a specific branch location, they could have opened a branch there or bought an existing branch at that location. Acquiring another bank with at least 9 other branches, and usually many, many more, seems like a poor method to achieve this aim. So in the interest of time, I'm going to largely skip over going into much detail about how we construct our data set. We have about 2,700 acquired branches, only one of which was divested, and they're spread across 600 counties. One point is particularly important, and I'll return to it later. Some counties see one merger where a big bank comes in and takes over a medium-sized bank. It's easy to identify treatment here. For other counties, there are multiple instances of big banks taking over medium-sized banks. We use the first merger in these counties, but not any subsequent such mergers. So this is identification in a picture. This is Wells's acquisition of Marquette in 2002. Marquette was a $6 billion bank with 59 branches spread across Minnesota, South Dakota, and Iowa. The green dots in the bottom graphic show the locations of acquired branches. There's a large cluster in and around the MSA for Minneapolis. The top left graphic zooms into Cook County. The large yellow dots are branches acquired by Wells Fargo. The red dots are branches of small banks. And the small blue dots are other large and medium-sized branches unconnected to the merger. Finally, the top right diagram zooms in further to show how these exposed branches vary in their distance to an acquired branch. That is a formerly medium-sized branch of Marquette that is now a big-sized branch of Wells Fargo. Looking within a county like Cook that contained acquired branches, not all zip codes within that county contained acquired branches. We exploit this within county variation, calling them affected zip codes and non-affected zip codes. And then even within a zip code containing an acquired branch, small branches vary in how closely they are located to the acquired branches. Rodney talked about the challenges of inference in this domain. Our identification is strongest on the within zip code level, but our data are also more sparse at that level. So I now present some regression results about what we already find. These are all going to be in the spirit of a difference in differences methodology. We'll compare acquired to non-acquired branches pre and post merger, or we'll compare small branch outcomes pre and post merger within a county experiencing a zip code but separated by zip codes. Some of these zip codes will contain an acquired branch, as I mentioned, and some won't. First, looking within counties that saw a qualifying merger, we see the acquired branches have lower deposit growth post-merger compared to non-acquired branches, even after controlling for size. This is what the examiners told us to expect, which is nice. Here we see that branches located within a zip code containing an acquired branch had greater likelihood of being a small branch than in zip codes within the same county but didn't contain an acquired branch. That's a terrible sentence. I tried to rewrite it several times. I didn't really have a better way, so I'm just going to say it a different way that I'm not sure is any better. So put another way, a given branch is more likely to be small in an affected zip code post-merger than in a non-affected zip code. Largely, that's a fine way to look at it. This greater small branch likelihood could come from several sources. It could be that small branches attrit less in affected zip codes compared to non-affected zip codes within the same county. They don't. It could be that branches within an affected zip code are more likely to stay small compared to small branches within the same county, but located within a zip code that didn't contain an acquired branch. I don't show you this, but they aren't. Or it could be that small banks are expanding more into or within affected zip codes. And we see evidence of this. Now, why might this be? We can take it from the bankers themselves. Yan Lee yesterday presented results of the FDIC's Small Business Lending Survey. The survey asked bankers about whom they view as their competition. Small banks view other small banks and medium-sized banks as their primary competition. Less than 7% of small banks considered a big bank as their number one competitor, and less than a quarter considered a big bank as among their top 3 competitors. So a large bank coming in and taking over a medium-sized bank removes competition, according to the small bank survey responses. This makes those areas more attractive for small bank entry or expansion, which is what we appear to see. This all matches economic theory, but theory also says that whatever improvements there are to the competitive environment, the gains shouldn't persist as new branches come in to soak up the benefit. This is what we see. Again, looking at zip codes within a county, small branch deposit growth is no greater or lower within zip codes containing an acquired branch compared to neighboring zip codes within the same county that didn't contain an acquired branch. We see the same non-effect looking just within affected zip codes and comparing small branches closer and further from the acquired branch. One potential problem with our approach is how we handle counties with multiple mergers over time. I think it's important to talk about these things. Recall that we use only the first such merger where a big bank takes over a medium-sized bank. To the extent that mergers come one after another, our control zip codes may actually be treated zip codes shortly after the first merger, which is the one we use. This may be a problem, and there are a couple potential solutions if it is, but I haven't shown you any work on this. We also want to add some finesse around separately considering banks with assets less than 100 million. Finally, I want to briefly return to the possible explanations for why small banks are declining in number. I mentioned my skepticism very superficially about regulation as the culprit. I showed some results that big bank competition is perhaps not the culprit. Another possibility is that of preferences. Maybe customers in MSAs are looking for different things from their banking relationship than customers elsewhere. Things like banking by phone. Maybe they don't even want a relationship. We're exploring this in ongoing work. So in conclusion, we look at the competitive effects of small banks, competitive effects on small banks of big bank competition. We use merger activity as exogenous variation. We find an overall modest but positive effect. Exposure to a big bank entrance is associated with small branches seeing no greater attrition, more entrance or expansion, and no slower deposit growth. Thank you.